Before there were nations, before flags carried meaning, before the word Europe existed at all, there was only land, and the people trying to survive on it. A continent shaped by ice and fire. Rivers carved their way through dense forests. Seas connected distant shores while keeping them apart. Small groups gathered around open flames, unaware that the ground beneath them would one day become the center of empires, revolutions, and conflicts that would influence the course of the world. How does a scattered collection of communities become something that defines centuries? And once that process begins, is it ever possible to stop it? Because in Europe, change did not come in a single moment. It built slowly, and then it accelerated. Long before cities or kingdoms, Europe was largely wilderness. Forests stretched across vast distances, broken only by winding rivers. Winters were long and severe. Summers were short, but full of life. Early humans moved with the rhythms of nature. They hunted and gathered, adapting constantly. They followed migrating animals, watched the skies, and passed down stories to make sense of an unpredictable world. Life was lived in small groups, close to the land. It was simple in structure, but never easy. Food was not guaranteed. Survival depended on skill, luck, and cooperation. Then, gradually, something shifted. Agriculture began to take hold. Forests were cleared. Fields appeared. Communities settled in one place. People no longer relied solely on what they could find. They began to grow, to manage, to control. This change was quiet, but its impact was profound. For the first time, people could stay in one place. They could build lasting homes. They could plan for the future. And with permanence came structure. Roles became defined. Leadership emerged. Power began to concentrate in new ways. Across the Mediterranean, early civilizations developed. Settlements grew into cities. Trade routes connected distant regions. Goods and ideas moved more freely than before. Then came a force that would shape the continent for centuries. It began as a city, a settlement near a river, surrounded by hills. But it did not remain small. Through discipline, organization, and ambition, it expanded outward. Roads linked distant territories. Armies moved with precision. Systems of law and governance were established and carried across vast regions. For a time, much of Europe came under a single framework. Order replaced fragmentation. But that order came with consequences. Expansion brought conflict. Communities were absorbed, reshaped, or displaced. Stability existed alongside control. At the same time, ideas traveled with that expansion. Engineering, administration, philosophy. Systems were built that would influence generations. The pace of change increased. And then, slowly, the structure began to weaken. Internal strain grew, political tension, economic pressure, overextension. At the same time, groups beyond its borders moved inward, driven by their own needs and pressures. Some came to settle, others to take advantage of opportunity. The system that had once held much of Europe together began to unravel. Cities declined. Trade slowed. Infrastructure fell into disrepair. What followed is often described as a dark period, not because nothing happened, but because much was lost or transformed. Knowledge became less accessible. Literacy declined. Local authority replaced centralized control. Fortified structures appeared where open urban spaces once stood. Life became more localized, more uncertain. And yet, even in this period of fragmentation, new foundations were forming. A different kind of unity began to take shape. Faith spread across the continent, offering a shared framework where political unity had faded. Churches became central to community life. Their presence was both physical and cultural. Bells marked time. Rituals structured daily existence. Religion became deeply intertwined with authority. It influenced laws, guided moral thinking, and shaped leadership. But it also became a source of tension. As kingdoms expanded, ambitions grew. Borders became more defined. Armies were organized. Conflict became a recurring part of life. Battles were fought over land, influence, and belief. Fortifications were built and contested. Agricultural lands were often drawn into these struggles. For most people, daily life remained difficult. Farmers worked land they did not own. Obligations to local rulers were constant. A failed harvest could have serious consequences. Conflict could disrupt entire communities. Yet over time, change returned. Trade began to increase again. Markets expanded. Towns and cities re-emerged, not as remnants of earlier empires, but as centers of commerce and exchange. Merchants traveled between regions, carrying goods, skills, and ideas. And then, a shift in perspective. Ancient knowledge resurfaced. Texts that had been preserved or rediscovered began to circulate. Scholars revisited earlier ideas, questioning established assumptions. Artists and thinkers began to look at the world differently. There was a renewed focus on human potential. This period marked a turning point. Art became more detailed and expressive. Scientific thinking began to challenge long-standing beliefs. Exploration expanded beyond familiar boundaries. Ships set out into unknown waters. What followed reshaped not only Europe, but much of the world. New lands were encountered. New societies came into contact with European powers. Resources flowed back into the continent, contributing to economic growth. But this expansion also brought systems of control and exploitation. Local populations were often placed under pressure. Labor was extracted. Wealth accumulated unevenly. Europe's influence expanded rapidly. But stability did not necessarily follow. As ideas continued to spread, divisions emerged. Religious unity fractured. Conflicts arose that were as much about belief as they were about territory. Some of these struggles lasted for generations. Advances in weaponry changed the nature of warfare. Armies became larger. Engagements became more destructive. And then another transformation began. One driven not by exploration, but by innovation. Machines began to change how work was done. At first, they were simple tools. But over time, they developed into complex systems. Production shifted from small workshops to large factories. Steam power allowed goods to be produced at unprecedented scale. Urban areas grew rapidly. People moved from rural regions to cities, seeking opportunity. But life in these new environments was often challenging. Factories operated continuously. Conditions were demanding. Work was repetitive and tightly controlled. Entire families, including children, contributed to industrial labor. Pollution became a defining feature of many cities. This was progress in one sense, but it brought new difficulties. Living conditions were crowded. Public health concerns increased. Economic gaps widened. And yet, the changes continued. Transportation improved. Railways connected regions. Communication became faster. Ideas spread more widely. With these changes came new expectations. People began to call for representation, for improved conditions, for a greater voice in how they were governed. Political movements grew. Revolutions challenged established systems. Long-standing forms of authority were questioned, and in some cases replaced. The idea of the nation-state took shape. Identity began to shift, from loyalty to a ruler, to a shared sense of peoplehood. But this shift brought both unity and tension. Alliances formed between states. Rivalries deepened. Eventually, the focus turned inward. Conflict on a scale not seen before emerged within Europe itself. The causes were complex, built over decades of competition, mistrust, and shifting power dynamics. A single event triggered a much larger conflict. War spread across the continent. Soldiers lived in difficult conditions. New technologies changed how wars were fought. The scale of loss was significant. And when it ended, it did not resolve the underlying tensions. Instead, it set the stage for another, even larger conflict. A second war followed, affecting nearly every part of the continent. Cities were heavily damaged. Civilian populations were deeply affected. The scale of destruction was immense. Yet within that period, there were also moments of resilience, efforts to rebuild, to endure, to move forward. When it finally ended, Europe had changed again. Not only in its physical landscape, but in its outlook. Previous systems had proven insufficient. There was a need for a different approach. Efforts were made to encourage cooperation. Economic and political partnerships began to form, aimed at preventing future conflict. At the same time, the continent remained divided. Two contrasting systems stood in opposition, separated by ideology and influence. For decades, tension remained, shaping global dynamics. Gradually, that division began to ease. Barriers that had once seemed permanent were reduced. Movement between regions became more open. Cooperation increased, though not without challenges. Europe began to redefine itself, not simply as a collection of competing states, but as a network of interconnected societies. Even so, the past continued to shape the present. Its influence could be seen in architecture, in language, in national boundaries, and in institutions. Europe did not simply experience history, it contributed to shaping the broader modern world. Its ideas spread across continents. Its conflicts had global consequences. Its developments influenced patterns that others adopted, adapted, or resisted. But this legacy is complex. It includes periods of achievement and innovation, alongside moments of hardship and inequality. It is a story of progress, but also of consequence. And those consequences are still visible. Economic systems established long ago continue to influence global structures. Political ideas that emerged during times of crisis still inform modern governance. Cultural identities shaped by centuries of interaction and conflict remain strong. Europe is not just defined by its geography. It is defined by its continuous transformation. As time moves forward, new challenges emerge. Questions about identity, unity, and direction remain open. What defines Europe today? A shared past? A collective future? Or an evolving idea that continues to be tested? The continent that once drove global change now faces a different kind of transformation, one shaped less by expansion and more by reflection. Perhaps that is one of the enduring patterns in its history. Europe has never remained fixed. It has changed repeatedly, through growth, division, and renewal. Each era has believed it understood its place in history. Each has been followed by another phase of change. Because history does not come to an end. It continues to unfold. And within the everyday life of modern Europe, in its cities, its institutions, and its people, the next phase is already beginning. Not always visible, not always predictable, but, as before, inevitable.